Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our third and final panel for today. My name is Marcus Gibson, and I direct the Princeton Initiative in Catholic Thought here at the Aquinas Institute. I'd like to welcome you all to our panel on inclusion under the title, How Should We Meet People's Need for Inclusion and Recognition? Our panelists presenting on this theme will be Professor James Greenaway, Reverend Dr. Sam Wells, and Professor Jennifer Herdt. As usual, we'll have 15 minutes for each of the three presentations, more or less, followed by 45 minutes of question and answer. And now some brief introductions before we begin in the order of the presentations. James Greenaway is the San José-Lonergan Chair in Catholic Philosophy at St. Mary's University in San Antonio, Texas. His academic work ranges over medieval and political philosophy, philosophy of law and of religion, and philosophical anthropology. And his most recent book with University of Notre Dame Press is titled A Philosophy of Belonging, Persons, Politics, Cosmos. Sam Wells is Vicar of St. Martin in the Fields, before which he served as Dean of Duke University Chapel. He is also visiting professor of Christian ethics at King's College and a regular contributor to Thought for the Day on BBC Radio 4's Today program. He has published 44 books, including works on Christian ethics, mission, ministry, scripture, liturgy, and preaching. Jennifer Herdt is Gilbert L. Stark Professor of Christian Ethics at Yale University's Divinity School. She is the author most recently of Assuming Responsibility, Ecstatic Eudaimonism, and the Call to Live Well. And she has published widely on virtue ethics, early modern and modern moral thought, and political theology. We're beginning with our first presentation by Professor Greenaway.
Okay, thank you. It's wonderful to be here. And in the introductions this morning, Brandon was saying that we have people from all over. And he talked about people from South Texas. And, well, I think that would be me, since I'm in San Antonio. But I'm not your typical Texan, because I'm from Northern Ireland. And, you know, that's not a trivial fact for our topic. You know, in Northern Ireland, we have practiced identity politics murderously well for a long time. But what Northern Ireland also shows is that there is a way beyond the impasse. There is a way out of the Aeschylean cycle of violence upon violence upon violence. Northern Ireland shows that there really can be a recognition of mutual suffering. It shows that there is such a thing as political and historical penitence and forgiveness. So anyway, I better get to my paper. I wasn't going to talk about that, but okay. So, all right. So we're here to talk about inclusion and recognition. But I want to ask, what is belonging? And I want to offer an answer. Belonging is communion. We belong in different kinds of communities because there are different kinds of communion. St. Augustine has given a good account of what belonging is. In Book 19 of his City of God, he wrote that a people is the association of a multitude of rational beings united by a common agreement of the objects of their love. A people is a community, not a statistical aggregate and not a demographic. They are a community because they are in communion through loving particular objects or goods in common. And Professor Lillo was speaking earlier about Aristotle on civic or political friendship. The love that binds a community is directed not necessarily to one another, but in the first instance to those objects or goods by which we come into communion with one another. Through a shared love of those objects, we find one another in community. Not that community means tranquility by any means. I may not agree with my neighbor, I may not even like my colleagues, or enjoy the company of many of my fellow compatriots, and I may dispute with them about what our commonly loved objects mean, like, for example, the meaning of liberty and equality in a constitutional republic like this. or indeed the meanings of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But the point is that we do agree that these goods are worth talking about. The communion by which any community lives, from a family, through the city, to the nation, is a turbulent affair, full of debate and dialectical struggle. But to the extent that we are loving the same goods, we can endlessly argue about their meaning. We are in communion, we are a community, through our shared love of those goods. No doubt the meanings of these objects we love in common are subject to further differentiation, and for this we must listen to what others have to say, because they too love our objects. Together we must clarify and affirm the development of our commonly loved objects. And again, a community is a communion of persons, a belonging of persons. So any consideration of inclusion and recognition initiatives in an institution is for the sake of belonging. So what is belonging? Let me offer this. There seem to be two aspects that are important for belonging. The first is surely that I care to be here with you, in communion with all that makes us family, friends, a community, a people. Let's refer to this aspect as existing toward. And what I mean by that is, to exist toward is to desire. It is my effective orientation towards someone or something. Some good that I can love with you. In intimate forms of communion, you are the good that I love. In non-intimate forms, like universities and political society, I love the goods you love. I am existing toward them. Still, in order to belong, existing toward doesn't seem to be enough. Something more than desire on my part is needed. In addition to my desire to belong, you or it or they must also accept, reciprocate, or acknowledge my desire in some appropriate, meaningful way. To be recognized and welcomed is to find that one is existing from the other. This then becomes the second aspect of belonging that's necessary. So who am I? That's the question of who or what I exist from. Well, I'm husband, father, friend, son, brother, colleague, neighbor, compatriot, and a fellow human being, subject to the conditions of mortal existence in the cosmos that holds us all. I exist from all of these at once, and toward them I exist too. And this is my belonging. And these seem to be the two phenomenological conditions of belonging: existence toward and existence from. Existence is not an abstraction. Nobody just exists like a free-floating atom. If I have the desire to belong so that I find that I exist towards someone or something, and if that desire is concretely realized so that I know that I now exist from that ground or home that holds me, then I may indeed experience belonging and know that I do belong. Then, phenomenologically speaking, I am at home. Or at least with a home to call my own somewhere, I find that I am homeward bound. To exist toward and to exist from are the two conditions of belonging where I want to make room for you, and you are prepared to make room for me. Crucially, belonging is meaningful only in terms of the subject who can experience, understand, affirm, and value it. And the subject then is always the person. And without the person, any discussion of belonging lacks context, concreteness, and intelligibility. So for our purposes here, let us consider inclusion and recognition initiatives as means toward the end that is belonging. And since it is only the person who can exist from and exist toward another, and since it is only in and among persons that belonging in community can happen, institutional efforts to foster belonging are rightly directed toward the inclusion and recognition of each person who wants to belong in that institution and who loves the goods by which that institution is already a community. Of all institutions, one might expect that religious ones would be best geared toward cultivating inclusion and recognition for the sake of belonging. Generally, theirs is a mission to serve what is sacred, to attend to what holds absolute value. The horizon of the religious institution is open to the transcendent and immanent dimensions of meaning, whose intersection is the person. Therefore, it's not unrealistic to expect that initiatives that support inclusion and recognition will be grounded in what is already a mission to serve sacredness, with a special focus on the flourishing of the person and communities of persons. I'll speak about the Catholic University, since I know it best, and Catholic social teaching, which offers an already well-developed value tradition. The foundational principle of Catholic social teaching is the person, and by extension of the person's intrinsic relationality, this includes the family and communities of persons. One might say that the goods loved in common by Catholic universities are persons, persons human and persons divine, and the bonds of communion that hold them. By loving these goods, the Catholic University has become a community. As shorthand for this, let's follow Matthew Petrusek's recent suggestion of the acronym DES, Dignity, Equality, and Solidarity. These three terms form a cluster of mutually dependent meanings which place the primacy upon the living, breathing person in our midst, and again, by necessary extension, the flourishing of persons within families and communities. So the question that every Catholic university must ask is whether their DEI offices and initiatives intentionally begin with the Imago Dei. That is, are they in line with over a century of development in Catholic social justice and with over 2 millennia of socially directed Christian charity, or do they take their bearings from other sources? Does concern for the common good in a Catholic university involve both persons and their communities without qualification, or does it restrict itself only to identifiable social groups? If the former, then DEI can become a powerful administrative advocate for greater dignity, equality, and solidarity, anchored in every person and every community of persons. If the latter, then both inclusion and recognition become exposed to manipulation by those who think about social justice only on the social level, without ever penetrating to the level of the person, who is always the belonging person or the potentially belonging person. Let's briefly consider a figure which might prove helpful in thinking about the relationship between DES and DEI. The German writer Karl Amery provided a critique of German society during the Nazi era. Amery, no champion of Christianity, makes a crucial distinction between what he called primary and secondary virtues that has relevance here. The key word, he writes, and this is a longer quotation, but it's worth quoting. The key word for the lower middle class system of virtues in Germany is Anstand. It is untranslatable, like decency or Honestät. What is German Anstand? It was the sum total of virtues adequate for the urban or rural middle class way of life. It included such things as honesty, diligence, cleanliness, punctuality, reliability in service, obedience to authority. It's not difficult to see that this system really emphasizes none of the primary Christian virtues. Neither faith nor humility, neither charity nor asceticism are written large in this system of Anstand. The whole lot can be called secondary virtues. Virtues, therefore, which do not imply any ends in themselves, but must be assigned to determined goals in order to be positive. End of quotation. Honesty, courage, punctuality, cleanliness, and so on are what Augustine might have called intermediate goods. That is, each of them is genuinely a good, but their goodness functions instrumentally. They are intermediate goods because when rightly directed, they can powerfully bring about the achievement of the primary virtues. However, since they are a means to an end, they're also susceptible of being misled and abused. For Amery, the secondary virtues of middle-class life realize their worthiness in the service of a primary good. But if that primary good is absent or replaced by a goal that is less than virtuous, the secondary intermediate goods become debased in their service of vice. Thus it is that the middle-class Anstand, or decency, as a set of secondary virtues, is by itself always vulnerable to manipulation. Amery gives examples from the German context. Another quotation. I can appear punctually for service in the priest's house or in the Gestapo cellar. I can be fastidious in writing about the final liquidation of the Jews or in social welfare work. I can wash my hands after an honest day's work in the cornfield or after my activities in the crematorium of the concentration camp. End of quotation. The point is that otherwise noble virtues can be perverted if directed towards ignoble ends. In a parallel way, so too can the nobility and worthiness of inclusion and recognition be subverted if they're not lifted into the higher primary integration that is provided by an emphasis on persons, family, and communities of persons and families. If DES summarizes what is always owed to the terminal value of the person and community of persons, then it's plausible to consider DEI as a set of instrumental subsidiary values. That is, inclusion and recognition initiatives as part of DEI programs find their completion only when they're rightly directed towards DES as expressive of the terminal value of the intrinsically relational person. The danger, as I see it, is that inclusion and recognition initiatives can become counterproductive and militate against belonging if directed towards some other end. In a time like ours, when institutions seem to have joined the general drift toward administrative uniformity and progressive ideology, there are at least two problems associated with DEI. The first, as I see it, is what we might call the soft progressivism of well-meaning administrators whose industry standard bias training passively, aggressively invites you to put the thought police into your own head and to speak only according to approved speech codes. Not to mention the community-destroying managerial positivism that creeps and creeps and creeps ever further in search of empirical data, demanding compliance and reducing all performance to a set of numbers. The other problem is with the hard progressivism of activists. Since the evolutionary march of progress demands critical deconstruction, all notions of beauty, claims to truth, and acts of goodness in the present and in history are dismantled, perhaps with reason itself. Rather than the beauty, goodness, and truth by which we come into communion through a shared love, ideology unmasks everything, leaving us with nothing but raw power and drives the engine of alienation in our institutions. So perhaps the problem is less with DEI than with the ideological commitments of the programmers. But let us remember that DEI arose to counter, among others, the very real problem of non-recognition and exclusion. This was problematic precisely because individual representatives of various social groups were never merely individual members of groups, but more precisely persons. Racism, sexism, prejudice against LGBT and others, as well as religious tribalism, are all manifestations of the problem of non-recognition and exclusion against the persons who belong in the disfavored groups. Such non-recognition and exclusion are violations of persons, because what is not recognized is their personal character, personal merit, personal innocence and personal guilt, personal achievements and failures, but only their impersonal status as group member. When the person is a putative member of the outgroup, they are excluded. Again, not because of their own personal worthiness or lack thereof, but because of the exclusion of the group. In other words, the ground zero of the original problem of exclusion lies in the refusal to perceive, understand, affirm, and value the personhood of the other. Persons are not merely individuals, infinitely reproducible and infinitely replaceable, like mannequins. But when persons are reduced to mere individuals, to individual representatives of social groups, they do become replaceable by any other individual whose socially relevant characteristic makes them another representative of the group. What is eclipsed in the shift from personhood to individual representative of a group is the person's radical uniqueness. So our original exclusionary bias was that we refused to see persons wanting only to indulge our resentment and to divide the world up into the simplicity of in-groups and out-groups. I'll close with this. If a Catholic university or any institution is grounded in a common love of the terminal good that is the intrinsically relational person, then each of its DEI efforts can be brought to their proper completion. A rightly ordered DEI nested within Catholic social teaching is potentially very powerful, because in serving the primary values of DES, dignity, equality, solidarity, it is focused upon the entire institutional community of persons. As a set of instrumental tools to serve dignity, equality, and solidarity, it will be the work of DEI to include and to recognize all persons as unique and as uniquely belonging to their places, times, cultures, and to our universal humanity in the cosmos. Inclusion and recognition initiatives that welcome each person simultaneously welcome the diverse communities that each person already belongs to. DEI, rightly oriented, has the terminal value of the person to aim at, and thus a noble mission to attend to. Rightly ordered towards DES, DEI would have a mission that could compel the admiration and participation of all well-meaning people.
Thank you, Professor Greenaway. And now a presentation from Professor Herdt.
We all long for home. This longing is perhaps nowhere as sharp as when what once felt like home no longer does. When we go from feeling like insiders to feeling like outsiders. When we are confronted by the strange and bereft of the familiar. Augustine reminded us that this kind of homesickness is exactly what we should expect. Pilgrims are not at home, not yet. And if we find ourselves getting too comfortable, it might be a sign that we are cozying up to the powers that be and losing sight of the heavenly city for which we rightly yearn. Jesus' ministry was one of boundary-crossing disruption, of table fellowship with outsider sinners and rebukes to insider Pharisees. Jesus calls Zacchaeus down from the sycamore tree and invites himself to dinner. He includes Zacchaeus in his ministry by venturing into Zacchaeus' own profane space. Zacchaeus is empowered to become host, to become, together with Jesus, an agent for healing wounds of exploitation. Or again, Jesus heals those excluded from the community by disability. 10 lepers are healed. It is the Samaritan who returns to give thanks, who grasps that the healing power of Jesus is a power that overcomes exclusion and the fear and hatred that are its accretions, that brings together Samaritan and Jew as it brings together lepers with those who have shunned them. To be a Christian is to be taken up into the body of Christ, and this is a form of inclusion that can be surprising and discomforting, of finding oneself grafted together with twigs and branches that, well, rub one the wrong way. Inclusion can feel an awful lot like exclusion as we grow into our vocation as creatures invited into the fellowship of the divine life. I heartily welcome the intent of this conference to identify shared commitments amidst all the mudslinging and polarization around DEI at present. And I was particularly glad that the conference organizers chose to include this panel on inclusion and recognition. I think this offers a pathway into the conversation that can be helpful in moving beyond certain impasses. This is because the category of inclusion has its own distinctive shape and history, one centered around disability. I thus briefly unpack that history and its significance before turning to recognition. In the 1950s, special education for students with disabilities existed in many school districts, But the norm was that these students were cordoned off in separate classrooms. When the Supreme Court in Brown versus Board of Education overturned the notion of separate but equal education for Black and white students, thinking about disability also began to change. In 1975, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act was passed, legally recognizing the right of students with disabilities to receive free and appropriate public education. The 1975 Act was framed in the language of equal opportunity. It included a provision that students should be placed in the least restrictive environment consistent with achieving educational ends, allowing for the maximum possible opportunity for students with and without disabilities to interact with one another. It specified that separate schooling for students with disabilities may occur only when the nature or severity of the disability is such that instructional goals cannot be achieved in the regular classroom. In 1990, the much more widely known Americans with Disabilities Act prohibited discrimination against people with disabilities in employment, education, transportation, and public accommodation. The ADA specifically names the isolation, segregation, and exclusion of persons with disabilities as a social problem that the Act is intended to address, and names full participation as a goal of the Act. The language of inclusion began to be used in the early 2000s in the context of including children with special needs in the ordinary classroom. This was based on research indicating that this approach benefited both students with and those without special needs. Inclusion sought to provide appropriate supports and learning strategies for all students without the stigma of segregation. It is not to be confused with mainstreaming, in which students with special needs are simply placed in the regular classroom without special individualized assistance. Inclusion in the context of disability has always been a complex and highly differentiated matter. Students with special needs are often still taken out of the general classroom for individualized instruction for some period of the day, and some students don't benefit from being included in the general classroom. The ideal of inclusion abstracted from any context might suggest that the goal to be secured is simply that all or some previously excluded group be absorbed within an existing institution and its practices. But note that inclusion, unlike mainstreaming, required a significant transformation of the general classroom so as to provide individualized education to each student. It is a demanding ideal, and doubtless one that is rarely realized. But it is helpful to remind ourselves that inclusion never meant the blanket affirmation of the status quo of the institutions in which the once excluded were now to be included. One frequent critique of diversity programs is that they fail to recognize this. Diversity is just there to add color to brochures and allow administrators to proclaim statistics, not in any way to change institutions. From the other side, one sometimes hears the idea that calls for inclusion stand in tension with calls for the transformation of an institution. If a group seeks inclusion, the argument goes, they ought to embrace the history and character of that institution, not seek to change it. Inclusion, though, was from the beginning differentiated from mainstreaming. The judgment that the educational system would be more effective for both students with and those without disabilities if students with disabilities were included in the general education classroom was not a judgment that the general education classroom should continue with business as usual. Education is a central social good and a nearly indispensable avenue of access to other central social goods. One can recognize these goods and seek inclusion in these institutions while finding many aspects of their history and character deplorable. Recognizing that opportunities within higher education, for instance, are distributed through an old boys network that perpetuates privilege, one might well seek greater transparency in processes. Does this mean that one fails to embrace the distinctive character of the university? No, it means that one distinguishes between the goods of the institution and the deformation of these goods. To have a sense of belonging in a community of learning is to be situated so as to participate fully and benefit fully in the common pursuit of knowledge and truth. Are there limits to inclusion? To be sure, these are properly set by its ends. The movement for the inclusion of students with disabilities in the general classroom, as I've said, grew out of evidence that inclusion made for better education, both for those with and those without disabilities. But this is not always and everywhere the case. There are times when a special needs student needs a kind of instruction that can't be provided in the general classroom, or is so disruptive that their presence inhibits rather than enhancing the learning of others. The Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits discrimination in education on the basis of disability. This positively requires public colleges and universities and private colleges and universities receiving federal aid to provide students with disabilities academic adjustments and auxiliary aids and services that afford students with disabilities an equal opportunity to participate in the school's program. And we're likely all familiar with the sorts of adjustments that are typically provided in the university setting. Additional time to complete assignments, a quiet room free of distractions for the taking of exams, assistance with note-taking. What is not required is the lowering of academic standards. And good judgment is obviously needed in order to differentiate between providing adjustments that enable full participation and making adjustments that lower standards, and between auxiliary aids that afford an equal opportunity and those that give an unfair advantage. Not everyone can benefit from a university education, and seeking to include those that cannot only serves to accentuate their lack of belonging. Furthermore, where there is evidence that accommodations fail to secure equal opportunity or even backfire, exacerbating mental health problems and harming those with disabilities, systems need to be changed. And this applies also, of course, to evidence that standard diversity trainings are ineffectual or positively counterproductive. At the same time, it's critical to recognize that inclusion always involves change, and change is uncomfortable. Indeed, it is often experienced as loss. This panel invites us to pair reflection on inclusion with reflection on recognition. Some worry that calls for recognition on the part of the once excluded boil down to egoistic pursuits of power and status that operate by way of a kind of inversion. Claims to lack of power and status fund demands for recognition in a kind of self-reinforcing cycle. To be recognized as lacking power and status is to be granted a certain kind of power and status, and this particular form of power can be fed, strangely enough, only through the ongoing recognition of one's marginalization and oppression. I'm reminded here of critiques that have been made of the discourse of human rights, charging that rights talk feeds possessive individualism, encouraging persons to focus on their entitlements to the neglect of their obligations to others and the cultivation of virtues that sustain the common good. Nicholas Wolterstorff restored sanity to this discussion, in my view, by shifting perspectives, noting that, quote, the presence of the other before us places a claim on us, issues to us a call to do justice, end quote. When we hear the charge today that those seeking inclusion and recognition are focused on themselves, on their own power and status, we should, I think, turn this around. What claims are placed on those of us who are already at home in institutions of power and privilege by those who have long been excluded? Christians in particular are called to speak up for the wronged, to acknowledge the claim their presence or absence places on us. Recognition, like inclusion, is a relational good. Indeed, our longing for recognition reveals just what deeply social creatures we are. As Charles Taylor recognized, we become fully human only dialogically, through exchanges with others, and, quote, a person or people can suffer real damage, real distortion, if the people or society around them mirror back to them a confining or demeaning or contemptible picture of themselves, end quote. Thinking in a theological register, recognition receives its deepest possible affirmation by way of the fact that God seeks recognition from God's creatures. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. In the incarnation, God reveals God's self to creatures that they might come to recognize, know, and love their Creator. Of course, God does not seek recognition from creatures out of any lack or need. God seeks recognition for the sake of communion, for the sake of bringing creatures into the fellowship of the divine life. Our recognition of God benefits us, not God. But our deep need to be known and accepted in our deepest being is affirmed by God's loving pursuit of our recognition. One of the most powerful affirmations of God's generous fulfillment of our deep desire and need for recognition comes in the Gospel of John's account of the resurrection of Jesus. Mary stands weeping at the empty tomb. The angels ask her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" Jesus' body, she thinks, has been taken away. Then Jesus asks her the same question, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She takes him to be the gardener. She's absorbed in her grief and fear. It is only when he addresses her by name, Mary, that she recognizes him. Called by name, recognized by Jesus, she becomes capable of recognizing him in turn. Recognition unlocks the power of faith and the witness she now joyfully carries to others. When we fail to offer recognition to our fellow human beings, fail to treasure them as unique and beloved children of God, formed by distinctive histories and experiences and material and social conditions, this is a failure of the neighbor love to which we are called as Christians. Of course, human calls for recognition may betray self-misunderstanding. In fact, they most likely often do. We seek recognition as tax collector and Pharisee, as Samaritan and leper. But being met where we are builds connection and trust and creates conditions for transformation. This is true both for those belonging to historically privileged groups as well as those belonging to historically marginalized and excluded groups. Both seek finally to be known not by labels, but to be recognized as the precious persons that they are, to be called by name as Mary was in the garden. The political clashes swirling around DEI today witness to a crisis of belonging and of recognition that is sickening our society today, a fraying of the social fabric with loneliness, isolation, depression, and anxiety spiraling out of control. Jesus, beckoning Zacchaeus down from the tree, healing lepers, introduces forms of inclusion that invite us into uncomfortable places of personal as well as material and social transformation. Jesus includes us at a table with strangers and enemies as we are kneaded into his body, formed for the pilgrimage to the heavenly city that sustains our longings for home.
Thank you, Professor Herdt. And now a presentation from Reverend Wells.
Our title is How Should We Meet People's Need for Inclusion and Recognition?
I'm going to revert to press conference. Behind the current turmoil about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I perceive three pervasive themes. One theme concerns narrative. As Kwame Anthony Appiah puts it, part of the function of our collective identities is to structure possible narratives of the individual self. Proponents of DEI understand a narrative by which certain social groups in the US have had their dignity, identity, and aspirations suppressed for centuries. The process by which those groups find visibility, validity, and flourishing is ultimately irresistible, but needs facilitating by education and asserting by regulation. Meanwhile, this reconfiguration provokes inevitable opposition, which must be anticipated and withstood. Such opposition largely comes from those who gained most from earlier settlements of power. These opponents of DEI offer a rival narrative generally based on the affirmation of decontextualized individual freedoms and often deriding the appeal to collectivities of oppression as specious or even disingenuous. Let me say at the outset that I recognize the narrative highlighted by DEI initiatives and condemn active, legalized, or unintentional structures of exclusion. A second theme transcends the current US context and highlights two insuperable flaws in the liberal project from its origins at the start of modernity. One is what happens when your expression of identity and freedom inhibits or denies my expression of mine. Thus, a Basque separatist and a Spanish nationalist each deny the other's notion of self-determination. Holding an independence referendum just for northeast Spain presupposes whose question this is to settle. The other is, to what extent may I tolerate you if you don't tolerate me or others? Thus, I may say I want the church to include all God's children, but how then do I include someone who refuses to recognize the dignity of a Christian in a same-sex relationship, especially if that Christian happens to be me? A third theme has been accentuated in the era of technology and social media. Western society has moved from an assumption that we accept our reality to an assumption that we change any aspect that's unsatisfactory. If my internal sense of gender doesn't correspond with the sex I was identified as having at birth, I less often find a way to accept the dissonance, but more frequently seek medical transition. Meanwhile, many members of the emerging generation are accustomed to performing their lives on social media, a location of instant endorsements and rejections. The forum for identity has shifted from long-term relationship with a small circle in which one is known to rapid evaluation by an assorted audience of strangers with volatile loyalties. This is a tumultuous context for addressing inclusion and recognition. In response, I shall briefly identify two related theological loci, namely resurrection and transfiguration, and proceed to outline two consequent theological themes, namely baptism and the communion of saints, that together, I believe, offer reframing possibilities. I start with the central locus. I want to reflect on what we learn about identity from Jesus' resurrection body as narrated in the Gospels. In short, there's genuine continuity. Jesus is still incarnate. God's purpose is still fundamentally to be with us in Christ. Jesus is still faithful to the disciples. He's looking for intimate, restored, and transformative relationship. He still has wounds in his hands and side. But there's also profound discontinuity. He's no longer dead or subject to death. He can walk through walls and disappear from a wayside inn. He can ascend to heaven. Everything in the New Testament assumes Jesus' resurrected body shapes our hope for our own resurrection. So here's a window into our ultimate identity, one of real continuity with our earthly selves, but also discontinuity. This is the definitive theological word on identity. It turns out our true and permanent identity is something that hasn't yet fully come about. If resurrection seems too distant and otherworldly, the locus that brings resurrection into the present tense is transfiguration. Like the resurrection, Jesus' transfiguration reveals his true identity, which lies beyond conventional recognition. Like the resurrection, the transfiguration episode discloses that identity emerges in relationship. In this case, the historic location of Jesus in regard to Moses and Elijah, the law and the prophets, and the present location of Jesus in relation to Peter, James, and John, his current companions, and the future leaders of the church. The shimmering light points out that the disciples both have and have not yet recognized who Jesus is. In corresponding fashion, we each both have and have not yet recognized whom we and one another are. Indeed, we each have an ultimate identity that only God knows and that even we cannot yet apprehend. Our identity is hidden with Christ in God. Like resurrection, transfiguration affirms that the initiative in identity lies with the Holy Spirit, but meanwhile offers a way to unlock our vocation and uphold dynamic accounts of identity. After all, it's from the Transfiguration episode on that Jesus turns to Jerusalem and begins to describe the necessity of his suffering path. It's a decisive moment in disclosing and developing his identity. Likewise, Transfiguration names the moments we perceive who we are called to be and where we're called to go to realize our identity. Compare these accounts of resurrection and transfiguration with two notions of identity common in contemporary discourse. One is discovery. Discovery depicts identity as a fixed thing located or established in our past. Through a combination of conscientization, therapy, education, pilgrimage, and lived experience, we can trace our way back to our identity and come to inhabit it. Our discovered identity may contravene social norms or disrupt ecclesial expectations, but to be true to ourselves, we must complete our quest and live into the consequences. Without freedom, we can't pursue our identity, and our integrity requires us to do so. But this notion is fundamentally atheological. It's a belief in the salvific effect of unearthing one's true self, but in a narrative that's centered on oneself rather than Christ, and on oneself in isolation rather than in relationship. A second contemporary way of understanding identity is construction. Construction appreciates our identities are built out of allegiances, attractions, primal urges, formative cultures, and signature characteristics. Sculpting such dynamics into a single or multivalent identity, we continue to curate our profile and refine it as we present it before others, often associating it with things we do or buy or campaign for. Unlike the first approach, which sees identity as given, this second model perceives identity as chosen and made. This is a thoroughly postmodern account that has no fixed identity and sees all as negotiable and fluid. I now want to explain how resurrection and transfiguration reshape our notion of identity by providing two alternative conceptions. Resurrection and transfiguration affirm that identity is fundamentally bestowed and revealed. After all, while it's insufficiently often acknowledged that none of us chooses to be born, it's beyond dispute that resurrection is an act entirely of God's grace rather than of our deciding or deserving. Like the first alternative approach of discovery, this sees identity as something we don't get to choose, but in this case, there is a choosing, just one where that choosing is done by someone other than us. It's not a simple equation that we choose equals freedom, while others choose equals oppression. Sometimes being chosen is best of all. The moment that crystallizes this sense of bestowal is baptism. Baptism addresses the first of the two themes of this seminar, recognition. This notion of bestowal preserves the dynamic character of identity because it doesn't conceive of identity as something fixed, static, and locked as a given in the past, like essentialist readings of male and female gender. Instead, it allows for an emerging sense of vocation to shape who we each come to be. At baptism, God says, I made you this way because I wanted one like you. But that doesn't mean we yet know the full extent of what's entailed by this way. At the same time, because baptism is grace, the identity it confers is not something we can construct. Instead, the initiative and principal direction derives from the Holy Spirit, and we find freedom in resting in that direction rather than resisting it. Resurrection, secondly, reshapes our notion of identity by affirming that identity emerges in relationship. In the words of Rabindranath Tagore, take us away from our natural surroundings, from the fullness of our communal life, with all its living associations of beauty and love and social obligations, and you will be able to turn us into so many fragments of a machine. The gospel accounts of resurrection and transfiguration are about identity revealed through relationship. Who Jesus is becomes apparent as he interacts with Moses and Elijah, Peter, James, and John, and to Mary Magdalene, the disciples en route to Emmaus, and the 11 in the upper room. My identity isn't a possession I own. It's something that becomes apparent in relationship to others, to other disciples, to the stranger, to the non-human creation, and to God. In other words, identity is fundamentally about belonging. According to Alistair MacIntyre, it's about answering the question of what story or stories do I find myself a part. The moment that crystallizes both the dynamism and the emergence of identity in relationship is the Eucharist. The Eucharist is where God's story, a neighborhood story, the church's story, and a congregation's story converge and coalesce. The term for the permanent experience of the Eucharist in establishing the identity of participants yesterday, today, forever, and across all places is the communion of saints. The communion of saints is the theological notion that addresses this seminar's second theme, inclusion. The communion of saints celebrates how God has created each one of us for a purpose we cannot fulfill without each other. How God loves us all equally, yet loves each one of us as if we were the only one. The communion of saints tells us we're part of a story that's simultaneously taking place now in the mundane and the limited, and forever in the full companionship of God. The communion of saints transforms our notion of identity by turning our attention from ourselves to God, from whom we uniquely are, to what God is creatively making us, from where we specifically are coming from to where we are personally and collectively going, from where we are restless to where we find our rest in God, from our exhausting and endless quest to define our identity to inhabiting the dynamic identity we're given as a child of God. From a theological perspective, identity is fundamentally not a discovery to be defended, but a gift to be received. Identity is not about recognition by society, but embrace by God. It's a story not about our assertion of what we are, but about God's invitation to what we may become. Identity is not about the isolation of establishing there is no one else on earth like me, but the solidarity of believing there is a role for each one of us in the body of Christ. The Feast of All Saints, celebrated this coming week, gives us something the quest for identity never can. It replaces individuality with communion, solitariness with relationship, static identification with dynamic transformation, endless self-obsession with eternal belonging. My anxiety about the notion of inclusion, as it is conventionally used, is that it presupposes there are a cluster of people in the centre whose lives are normal and sorted and privileged, and they should jolly well open the doors and welcome people in and be a bit more thoughtful and generous. This is such a patronising and paternalistic model. I'm a little concerned the title of this seminar, with its reference to we and must, may inadvertently endorse this way of thinking. By contrast, I once had a church warden who described our then congregation in very different terms. He said, "We're a bunch of misfits who somehow fit together." He wasn't regarding himself as normal and secure and somehow above it all. He was one of the misfits too. He was reframing the whole idea that there was a centre and a periphery, where the centre gave kindly hospitality to the periphery, because the cost of that idea is that the periphery feels humiliated and the centre feels smug. In summary, if the question is, how should we meet people's need for inclusion and recognition, the answer is, number one, who is the we that holds the responsibility and claims the right and assumes the possibility of doing this? Number two, if the we refers to those who don't experience exclusion to a significant degree, then the answer lies more in being with them in their desiring that inclusion and recognition, rather than defaulting into the working for / being for mindset that invariably dominates our public discourse. Number three, if the question is about how identity is formed theologically, resurrection and transfiguration offer us a balance of continuity and discontinuity, identity as recognized and identity as lying in the future. And number four, if the we as Christians, we commend the practice of re-narrating recognition through bestowal and baptism, and inclusion through belonging and communion, particularly the communion of saints. If we are embarking on a managerial quest to meet all people's diverse and changing needs, we will run up against limits to recognition and inclusion that may well be experienced as arbitrary and iniquitous. Much better to make a humbler project out of fostering and contributing to a culture in which there are many opportunities to find community in belonging and ultimate joy in communion.
I'll raise one question before we open things up. This is a question for Reverend Wells. As I was hearing some of those last remarks, I was reminded of the way some of the early church fathers will speak about the work of almsgiving, where the approach something like this. It's obvious that the poor have need of the material goods that the rich have to offer, but these fathers will insist. It turns out that the rich have at least as much need of the poor, if not more, insofar as they have need of the opportunity to grow in love, to grow in detachment, to exercise generosity, to forge bonds of love and communion. And as I was remembering this, I was just thinking, well, first, it seems like this approach has two benefits, it seems to me. One, it decenters the role of the rich and their agency when we think about almsgiving in a certain way. And second, it seems like it creates the opportunity, at least in principle, for a kind of communion between the richer and the poorer parts of society in this practice of almsgiving, rightly understood. So my question is just, looking to a model of almsgiving that looks like that, do we find there maybe some resources for thinking about the practice of inclusion or maybe the practice of hospitality that avoids some of the concerns that you raised towards the end of your presentation?
Poverty is a mask we put on people to hide their true wealth, and wealth is a mask we put on people to hide their true poverty. If we read the Beatitudes, and if those become formative for our theological imagination, then there is a profound reversal eschatologically. And so any designation of poverty is provisional and liable to be eternally reversed. And so any claim to righteousness by those we call rich is a short-term attempt to mimic the reversal and restitution that eschatologically will inevitably come.
Thank you. To the room.
Thank you so much. This question is for Professor Greenaway, and it's about your prefatory remark before you started talking about your paper. Did I hear you correctly that you said that in Ireland there are patterns of public forgiveness? I don't know if that's what you said, but you reminded me of a conversation I was having with my children a few weeks ago at dinner. They were asking about, they had heard that there had, all about public acts of apologies that are often made, apologizing to Native Americans for the land that certain universities are on, and apologizing to certain communities for slavery, etc., and apologizing for certain statues, and lots of public apologies that seem to be happening during this reign of DEI. And one of my children asked, well, are there any acts of public forgiveness after the apology is made? And it really got me thinking about the fact that we seem to apologize all the time, and there seems to be no public forgiveness going on so we can move past. If you want to talk about moving beyond the impasse, we're just wondering if Ireland or any of you have any thoughts on that, so I can answer my kids.
One of the things that I think we all enjoyed in Northern Ireland was seeing these, some of the local leaders of different communities within Belfast coming together and sitting down with each other and talking. It's like Joe Rogan on steroids, right? No holds barred, and just speaking from the depths of their soul to each other about what you had done, and hearing why, and then that went the other way. So they met each other as persons. They sat down and looked in each other's eyes, and they recognized, not just as an abstraction, but that this person in front of me suffered just as I've suffered. To be able to meet people like that, face to face across the table. But the funny side of it was that we had, I don't know if anybody here would know these people, but there was Ian Paisley, who was, he founded the Free Presbyterian Church and was very militantly, anti-Catholic, and for years was a political leader and very, very divisive. He formed a government with this other person called Martin McGuinness, who was a member of the Army Council of the IRA. And these two implacable enemies showed up one day in government. They just had their first meeting, and they came down the stairs laughing their heads off with each other. And they got the nickname of the Chuckle Brothers. And they found each other as friends. It was unbelievable. So these weren't big public pronouncements, all of this sort of show of, let's say, penitence and forgiveness. This just happened in the conversations that people had. The situation, the time, was a recognition that we have all suffered enough, no more. That now we have to do politics. And that means we have to be politically friends. Even if we don't like each other that much, there are things that we love in common. We have got to talk about this. And in that interaction between leaders who are persons, a genuinely personal, interpersonal interaction takes place where people can express their sorrow, and their penitence and receive forgiveness.
Yep.
I'd love to say a word to that question as well, if that's okay. It's much more mundane, and it has to do with the classroom today, and not with Northern Ireland. But it is a challenging time to be in the classroom, to be teaching these days, and in part it's because there are young people who have been conditioned to think that it's their task to call one another out when anything offensive is said, and they feel the weight of that responsibility on them to speak up and to do that. And so I try to set the terms for our engagement with one another in the following way, by saying, I will undoubtedly at some point say something offensive. I will undoubtedly say something wrong, and others will as well. And I invite us into a space of forgiveness. I mean, that we expect to fail. We expect one another to fail, and that's not to cover over the offenses. It's to create a space where it's not just about denunciation. There's something bigger that's going on in that space as well.
Can I have a go too?
Of course.
This is an all play. The reason I want to say something is because I do think, I think it was implied in the question, and I just want to underline that forgiveness and identity are profoundly wrapped up in each other, particularly theologically. So in a situation of wrong, we have the, shall we say, the offended party, the hurt person, who feels that this is now an indelible part of their identity, what has been done to them, and has a sense of the other person that this isn't a part of their identity. This is something they just did and moved away from, and doesn't fundamentally impact them, what you did to me. And what happens in forgiveness is some kind of reversal by which the offender, shall we say, acknowledges that this will always be part of my identity, and any reparation I can make will be inadequate. And that the offended party correspondingly lets go, primarily for their own sake. You know, they look themselves in the mirror and say, do I really want my whole identity to be taken up by this thing that was done to me? Am I allowing myself to be shrunk down to that person who's defined by this offense? And lets go of that and says, this is not ultimately the whole story of me. So they kind of swap places to some degree. And that's the sort of failure of forgiveness is when people feel that needs to be a complete, total process. You know, perfectionism is the enemy of the good in forgiveness. That actually making a significant stride for both of those, but because of the power differential, particularly in cases like you mentioned Native Americans and so on, it behoves the offending party to wait until the offended party indicates that the time is right. And so to make an apology when the offended party isn't ready can be experienced as a further offense. And that's something the offended party seldom grasps. Because they said, look, we said sorry. Why are you still cross? And the offended party thinking, I'm actually more cross than I was to start with. Because that is experience, that apology is experienced as a way of saying, oh, this now doesn't hurt me at all because I've apologized. You see what I mean? So that's, I mean, the point I'm making is how tied up forgiveness is with identity, and why it's appropriate that forgiveness is at the epicenter of what Christianity is, and therefore of a Christian notion of identity, which is what we're here to talk about.
Thanks so much for this rich panel, which was very theological. And it prompts a question I've shared with some people in the room. At the end of commencement at Princeton last year, I was marching alongside the DEI office, and one of them said to me, they know, even though I teach in the religion department, that I actually share the parabolic reversals that Reverend Wells just announced. You know, the Christians at Princeton seem the least transactional, the most multiracial, the most joyful group on campus. Is there anything we could borrow from them for our DEI orientation in the fall? And I said, well, you know, they believe in God, which was kind of a quick answer to keep marching. But how would you translate? And we don't need to have a seminar on pagan virtue, but it's related to some of the kind of lurking questions I heard in some of the other sessions. The university is not the church. Even a Catholic university is not the church. Certainly, Princeton is not a religious institution anymore. So are there just sort of secular analogies of this Christian vision of identity that might be helpful as a witness in my context? And I was thinking of like Stanley Hauerwas's article on why Stanley Fish should want to teach at a Christian university. But he also said, I still haven't figured out how to be a Christian at a secular university. Because if it doesn't have this account, then it's very difficult. It's almost how much of this conference is predicated on the larger question of what the university is for. And a lot of my colleagues think we are for the search for truth. We're not for the promotion of the common good. We're not for moral formation. We're not for all of these other things that Princeton is now asked to be doing. Let me do my research and pursue academic excellence, stripped of any account of a secular analogy of the communion of saints. So what answer would you have given that would have been better than the one I gave?
So to me, the most significant verse in the Bible is in Song of Songs, chapter 8, love is strong as death. Because it seems to me the epicenter of the Christian faith in ways that our virtuous pagans can understand. There may even be some of those in this room. That was a joke, by the way. It is the question of, is love stronger than death? And the epicenter of the Christian faith is clearly that it seems on Good Friday that it isn't, but it seems clear on Easter Day that it is. And in that lies our hope. And the problem with I really don't like doing this, but I'm going to say the left and the right side of this debate, shall we say. So the problem with the left side of this debate is that it can be so preoccupied with antagonistic notions of human interaction, whether that's class warfare or any of the different designations we've heard about in the course of today, that it suggests in Manichaean fashion that this Sherlock Holmes Moriarty battle is eternal. And therefore we can't confidently proclaim that love is stronger than death. The problem with the right side of this debate, the right, I heard leftist this morning, which is not a phrase I knew, but rightist side of this debate, shall we call it, is that it's so preoccupied with the declension narrative of something that is always in danger of slipping out of our hands and must be strongly clung on to, that it suggests that the Trinity actually can't look after itself, and we have to do some pretty ghastly things to defend it. So that's how I would both acknowledge the sins of the church, but also say that what the church is about is fundamentally recognizable within the contemporary academy. And then, within that, going back to James's original citation of Augustine about a university as a place that's concerned with common objects of love. The question is the love that is represented by Augustine's vision stronger than death?
So I think I would begin by saying the pursuit of truth is not nothing as a common object, and that granting that the university exists for the pursuit of truth is already identifying a substantive good to which it's devoted that moves it beyond relativism. It moves it beyond neutrality, even though some of those who embrace what they consider as strict neutrality appeal to the university's business as being solely about the pursuit of truth. That's already kind of a bit of a crack in terms of opening things up to identifying, at the minimum, shared proximate goods. And I think we can content ourselves with shared proximate goods because part of what we need to remind ourselves, and part of what I was trying to underscore, is that we get into a mess if we expect full belonging, right? If we aspire to too much in the university or in any institutions of this world. So we have to set our sights maybe a bit lower, but then not give up on this pursuit of building out shared commitments.
So I'll have a stab at that as well. I'll tell you a little story. Years ago, I remember watching an account on, or some report on the BBC about the famine in the Yemen. And of course, the war that's raging there now was the war that was raging then as well. And this report began with talking to a young woman who was holding her malnourished and baby who was clearly in some distress. And so she was being interviewed, and she was talking about just her experiences. Then the reporter went on, and they put the report together. And at the end of the report, it showed her, and she was weeping because in that time, her baby had died. And the impact on me watching that, I wasn't ready for that. I wept. There was something so searing about that. So, according to DEI, I'm a white guy. I don't get that. I'm not Yemeni. I'm not female. Not black. And I wept. What I'm talking about is that there is a common universal humanity, and we live in a common universal world. By the way, that's your key to seeing that there's a universal common God. But if you don't feel like going that far, okay. The point is that suffering and pain is real. Nobody doubts that. The human predicament is such that we are all potentially suffering, like that poor young woman. But so too is flourishing. So to evoke experiences of a common humanity seems to be a practical way of waking people up from this prison of identity politics. We are all human. We're all persons. That doesn't mean we're individuals, and I'm not being individualistic. Persons, to welcome persons, to see persons, is to actually engage in your own personhood too. And part of that evocation is, yes, your times, your places, your cultures, your historical background, the depths of insight even in your language, but also, as we've been talking about theologically, your humanity under God. So you don't have to use the theological language, but you do have to talk about our common humanity, because that's what's universal.
Just a programming note on the common humanity. The person in the UK that's doing really amazing work on this is Paul Gilroy, who spent a bit of time in America and Yale and felt swallowed up by some of these realities. He was a student of Student Hall, good friend of a lot of ours, Luke Brotherton, who's just stalled as Regis Professor at Christ Church. Oxford is going to do a conference on Christianity and Gilroy's New Humanism. So I have a question that's really kind of the other side of Eric's comment and question, which is if the university isn't the church, it's also the case that the church often isn't the church. All three of you pointed to, it strikes me, to profound resources that are ecclesial ones. DES, Jennifer's very rich scriptural imagination, Sam's account of the kind of sacramental unity of things like baptism. But it's also the case that people who are attracted to DEI, it strikes me as, often want to apply DEI to the church. And sometimes the name of that phenomenon is a kind of evangelicalism. My sense is that some of the attraction in university, why the burden that DEI carries is so intense in university life, is because some of these folks who are attracted to this find in the university a semblance of something closer to justice than what they experience in church. But you all are pointing to church. And so I wonder how you think about this question, that the church both offers those resources that you're talking about, and yet the church is often the place most in need of a DEI-like intervention. So how do you think about that question?
I talk about the difference between contract and covenant. So covenant is clearly scriptural language, Noah, David, Abraham, and so on. And contract feels like it sort of started with John Locke and people like that. And so the tendency is to say, oh no, church is covenant and world is contract. But I think that's a profound mistake. To me, contract represents the accumulated wisdom passed down over years, over centuries, so that if you're a landlord or a tenant, you realize that there've been landlords and tenants before, and you know what goes wrong in these relationships, and you codify that in a contract, and things will go wrong, and then you go back to the wisdom of what's happened and how those have been resolved before. And the difference is that contracts can grow into covenants. Covenants are about things like who holds your hand when you die, and contracts are about things like what happens when there's water dripping through the roof onto your carpet. And the mistake that Christians make is they somehow think you can start with a covenant, and then they become very arbitrary when the covenant goes wrong. And the reason why the world is furious with the church around this sort of territory is that, to take the most emotive thing in this room, when it comes to clerical sex abuse, the church, not so much today, but certainly 20 years ago, was talking the language of covenant, of forgiveness, when it was failing to meet its contracts of basic safeguarding of children, something that anyone in the world, let alone the church, would think was the least you could expect, the very least, be a place of safety. And that is something that the world finds it very difficult to forgive the church for, even a generation later. So, and I appreciate these are still present tense issues. So it seems to me that we, an institution like my own, adopts EDI type mechanisms, trainings and policies and so on, as a statement of humility that we if we're going to be listened to when we proclaim our covenants, we have to manifestly be keeping our contracts.
Thank you for the question. I think for me, it's been a question that's been hovering over the whole day, right? I mean, if we have Christian insight into the dignity of every human being as created in the image of God, and yet why does it take thousands of years for that to be expressed socially and politically? Why do we lose the insight of Gregory of Nyssa and it doesn't transform the world and so on? So on the one hand, there are incredible resources there in Scripture and in the traditions of the church and in the Christian faith. And I think they do transform the world extremely slowly and always with falling, the fall is a reality, and so it's a reality within the church as well as within the broader society. So it's a very complex mixture of there's grounds for hope, there's grounds for expecting transformation, there's also grounds for expecting evil, and evil will show its head everywhere in the church as well as everywhere else.
So I'm not a theologian, and I don't know how to do apologetics. I'm just a humble philosopher. So you can put me right if I'm wrong here. But I don't know. I don't agree that the Catholic University is not the church. I think it is the church. And then the question has to be, well, what do I mean when I say church? Well, of course, we all remember Nietzsche, who talked about Christianity, said there was only ever one Christian, and that was that Hebrew they nailed on the tree. Apart from that, that's it. So what do we mean by church? There are Catholics, and then there's the mystical body. And the idea of applying DEI to the mystical body, that seems like an absurd inversion. The way I tried to talk about it, using Matthew Petrusek's acronym of DES, Dignity, Equality, Solidarity, that seems to symbolize and give expression to the imago Dei, like the mirror, the image and the mirroring of God. And if the university and the church understood like as all the ecclesial organs, if they're trying to live out DES, then I think that provides the end that DEI would be the means toward if properly employed. Because DES is grounded in the mystical body of Christ. And so the Catholic University should be the mystical body of Christ too.
Please join me in thanking Marcus and the rest of the presenters.